Welcome to the Bradford Literature Festival. This is the winter session, and this session particularly is called Memory of Places. We have with us a panel of three very esteemed guests, and I'll just read out a short introduction of each of them. We have Ummi Sinha, who was born in the military hospital in Mumbai in 1952 to an English mother and Indian father, and grew up in India in the decade following independence. She moved to Britain in 1968. The experience of being an outsider looking for a place to belong, along with the impact of history, political and personal, on individual lives is a major theme in her writing. Ummi has an MA in creative writing and has taught at the University of Sussex for 10 years. She teaches creative writing classes and workshops, runs a performance storytelling club, and offers a mentoring and manuscript appraisal service for writers called Writing Clinic. She has had short stories published in the Cosmopolitan magazine and in Serpent's Tail anthology, and she is currently working on a new novel set in Italy and India between 1943 and 1948. Also with us is Amir Hussain. Amir Hussain was born and raised in Karachi, Pakistan, and has studied in South India for 2 years. But he has lived in Britain since the 1970s, where he migrated as a young teen. He has published various collections of short stories, such as Mirror to the Sun, The Other Salt, Insomnia, The Swans of Life, 37 Bridges, Hermitage, and his collection of Urdu short stories, Zindagi Se Pehle, and Turquoise. He has also written a novel called Another Gulmohar Tree. Amir is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and his recent memoir which he calls not how do you say it, Amir? Not really
instead of an autobiography.
Instead of Restless instead of an autobiography, and we will be talking about that also, of course. Also with us is young poetess Fatma Ijaz. Fatma Ijaz is based in Karachi, Pakistan, and teaches English and speech at the Institute of Business Administration. She is contributing editor at Pandemonium Journal. She has studied English at York University, Canada, and Eastern Michigan University, USA. She has been a reader at the Karachi Literature Festival in 2020 and 21. Her poetry has been published in numerous publications, including the Aleph Review, Ideas and Futures, and Bombay Review. She also writes on culture and books in Naya Daur and the Friday Times. Her poetry collection, The Shade of Longing and Other Poems, has just been released by the Little Book Company in October 2021. That is an ebook platform. Welcome, all three of you. I think I will start with Ummi. So, Ummi, what I want to first ask you about is your childhood, those years spent in India, post-partition India, that before going to England, and then of course the travel to England and the changes in culture and how that affected you as a child and growing up. And of course, we will later talk about your novel, which is also all about these memories and these places. So over to you, Ummi.
Thank you. Yeah, I was born in 1952, so I went to school in about 1958 or 9, I think. And of course, because it was only 10, 12 years after independence, there was a lot of emphasis on Indian history as opposed to the kind of British version of history that had been taught before. But I think the education was still very much English influenced. All the literature we read, I don't think I ever read anything at school that was that was written by an Indian, apart from, I think we did a bit of Gitanjali by Rabindranath Tagore, but only because I think he had, his poem was put to music for the Indian national anthem. And my father was in the Royal Indian Navy during the war, was in Britain throughout the war on the Arctic convoys. And then after independence, he remained in the Navy, in the Indian Navy, which was still very, very British in those days, because I think we had senior officers, British officers in the Indian Navy till the early 60s. And my mother was English. So we grew up in this kind of terribly English environment in India. And as a child, I think when I first went to school, I first experienced this feeling that there was something wrong with me, that nobody really wanted to talk to me or eat with me. And it took me a while to realize it was actually to do with being what was called a half caste in those days, and the whole caste system and all that. And but I think what I really remember of India is the sensory perceptions that I think never leave you, that they remain with you all your life, that as a child, the temperature, the colors, the noises, the smells of India have remained very, very evocative for me. And when I first came to Britain, that was the thing that I really missed. It was this feeling, which I actually describe in the beginning of Belonging, when Leela first comes to England. That sense of there seemed to be no color, no smells, everything seemed gray and cold. And, and still when I go back to India, I think I feel so at home in India, although mentally I'm probably more at home in Britain now. But I still go back to India a lot. I still have friends there and I visit them regularly.
So when we talk about memory, of course, the first word that comes to my mind is nostalgia. And all that you're talking about, the sensory perceptions, and that, of course, is nostalgia for a place. But tell me more about your first years in England and settling in England. And did you travel a lot back to India as a child, or was it after many years that you went back?
We came to England in 1968. My mother came back with the three of us, my brother, sister, and I. And I think at that point, I felt such a misfit in India that I thought when I came to Britain, I would just fit in. We'd been brought up on English novels, and, I had fantasized this wonderful country, like the kind of green of Robin Hood, and, that it would be this place full of people in kind of carriages and crinolines. And also that I would belong here. And we got to England, it was 1968, and it was the time of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, when he was talking about how if immigration continued, blood would flow in the streets. And I think just before we arrived, the first, I think it was Kenya, was it Uganda or Kenya first, where the Indians were evicted from Africa and they came to Britain. And I went to university in Coventry, University of Warwick. And Coventry was a town where there were a lot of car factories, and a lot of Indian immigrants settled in Coventry. So there was a real backlash against that. So it did feel a bit like coming out of the frying pan into the fire. So yeah, it was not altogether a positive experience. And I still feel, it's a funny thing, when I go to India, I feel this sense of relaxation, not just physical, but I feel people are more outspoken. I feel I can be myself in India. I noticed that as soon as I arrive at Heathrow Airport and I'm approaching immigration, it's almost like I have to kind of pull myself together and think, don't talk too loud, don't smile too much, don't, kind of you need to kind of be more of a stiff upper lip kind of person in Britain.
Yeah. So yeah, of course, and we are talking of memory of places. Places are all about people, and so also, especially with you, since you're coming to your novel, which is called Belonging, and of course that name itself speaks a lot about what the book is about, and about wanting to belong to a certain place, and knowing. You belong, as Amir does, to two places, England and India, and you especially, since you come from a family of, your mother was English and your father was Indian. So this novel, it's based on, on the characters. The protagonist is recalling things from from letters and diaries. How much of it is your own memories? Were there actually diaries and letters that, from your grandparents or your mother or your father or something that inspired the novel?
Nothing direct, no. I think there were elements of both my parents and some of the characters. There are links. I mean, the book starts in 1855. So 2 years later, there was what the British call the Indian Mutiny, what the Indians call the War of Independence. I'm trying to get this right. My great-great-grandfather, the rumor goes, was actually a Panch Hazari in Tatya Tope's army, again fighting against the British. And after the revolt was over, those troops were driven north into Nepal, what's now the Tarai, and my father said that his grandfather told him that he had grown up for his first 7 years in a forest because they were still hiding from the British. So there were links there. But in fact, in my book, I tell the story from the British point of view, because one of the things I thought was, with colonialism or any kind of oppression, really, it's very obvious in a sense what the victims are going to feel. But what I wanted to explore was the damage that it actually does to the oppressor to actually be in that position. And that British family actually go through considerable trauma, not just during the revolt, but also in terms of their regrets, their guilt, the change in attitude to Indians that happened between the first British people going out with the East India Company, who tended to assimilate into Indian life, and then later on in the Victorian period, when going native was considered a very bad thing. So I was kind of exploring all those kind of issues of belonging. And there's also, of course, an Indian character in the book, a Sikh, who's in England at school. So there's all kinds of issues of belonging in that novel. The Indian soldiers who were fighting in Europe in the First World War, the British who were displaced out in India, British children who grew up in India and then came home to Britain and didn't feel at home in Britain at all. And so really, I think that was obviously connected very much with the theme that's preoccupied me all my life, which is, how do you find a place of belonging when you've been displaced?
Right. Thank you. Though I am moderating this session, Amir and Fatma, you're more than welcome if you have a question or if you want to contribute anything to what Umi has said. So moving on, let me now put my first question to Amir. Amir, you have also got you were born in Karachi, you've lived in Karachi, but you've spent some time in India. And of course, your family, your parents moved around a lot before settling in Pakistan after partition. And then you, at a very early age, you moved to England. So your memories of Karachi, your early memories of
15.
Karachi,
I was 15 when I moved here.
you were 15, you were very young, yes. So, but 15 is an age, when you have, I mean, I remember my Karachi from the age, from a very young age. And 15 is an age where you're young, but not that young. You're still mature enough to have lasting memories. So let's talk about those memories, that Karachi. Again, your move to England, settling in England, was there any feeling of loss, or did you very quickly assimilate? And then, of course, about your visit back home or visits back home and then Karachi. When we talk about lost memories and the Karachi that we lost, the Karachi of our childhood.
Yeah. Well, I didn't assimilate, I adjusted. And I think I adjusted within maybe 24 hours of arriving here in England. I just was very disappointed with London when I first saw it, the first hour or two, when I saw these bleachers around South London and so on. And then I moved to live in Park Lane for a few weeks, Hyde Park Place, sorry. So I was right opposite Hyde Park, which was quite marvelous because that lacked most of my childhood living in big cities like Karachi and so on and so forth. There weren't parks that we could just move around in freely, or jumping on and off buses, waiting down notes at people and being told that we're far too much. And so yeah, it was actually quite privileged. It took me a while to feel that I was a bit foreign, maybe winter, and the fact that the reason I felt foreign was that most of my friends at school, for some reason, now I know the reason, it's a bit complicated. I was meant to go to one school, Westminster, which is, I just didn't feel like going. I took one look and I said, I'm not going to the school. So I was sent to a tutorial college, which was mostly Greeks and Persians and Koreans and Japanese and Palestinians. They all went home somewhere for winter. And I wasn't going anywhere because I had just arrived here and I had to think of England as home at that time. So there was snow and it was delightful and there were movies and there was all that. So it took me a while. 15 is hungry for experience. And then there were free books and masses of them, public libraries and then bookshops in which paperbacks were so cheap. So it was all quite comfortable. As far as Karachi goes, I had left at 13 because I think this is probably something that I've lived with all my life. I just felt it was time to move on. There was no special reason. It can be said that was partly to do with my schooling, about which school I should go to, and then my maternal uncle said at a wedding I had gone to attend at the age of nearly 13, that I should go to Uti in South India, where he was teaching. He was actually the founder of the school and the vice principal. He'd refused to be the principal. And it was a school that was run on Krishnamurti lines. So I went and lived there for a year and a half. Not lived, but I mean, I was studying, and during the holidays, we would escape to the plains or to my mother's family. My parents took turns to be with us, hated Uti. It was pretty for the first 2 months with the lake and the boats and everything like that, but the life there was stifling for someone. So when I decided to leave there and visited my grandparents and my aunt in Gwalior and Indore, that was a completely different life because I had only ever been there, as a visiting grandchild or nephew. But actually to be there for months at a time meant that I had to learn to speak whatever you want to call it, Urdu at home, Hindustani outside, etc. most of the time I had to content myself with what they call Bollywood movies today. In those days, we just called them, Hindi movies or Urdu movies because so many of them were in Urdu. So if anything, I assimilated there to an extent, from being this kid who was westernized and spoke English better than I did before. So what me and my younger sister and I became much more familiarized with that lifestyle between 13 and 15. So the boy who came to London was equally provincialized as he was a very urban Karachi boy. We go back to Karachi 12 and a half years. I look back on them as fairly magical. At the time, I didn't find them magical. It was just what I was used to. There were certain moments, of course, that were magical. But for me, Karachi hasn't gone. I think you've seen that, Huri. You see me very often when I'm there. I move around quite easily. I mean, I'm agoraphobic, so I don't like going in Ubers alone. But this friend of mine who you will have met, who's also a young poet in Karachi, we were talking about foreigners in Karachi or Pakistanis who'd come back. And he said, you very calmly sat on the back of my motorcycle 3 weeks ago when I drove you into Sadr. And you didn't seem nervous at all. And I said, really? I mean, why would I be nervous? For heaven's sake, what would make me nervous about it? So that's how I feel about Karachi. And when people bang on too much about, I want my old Karachi back. Yeah, of course, there are lovely things about it, but there are still very good things about it today. I feel nostalgic for my old home.
Right.
Yes.
I remember one of your stories, I think it was in The Other Salt, where the protagonist, Samir, he revisits the scenes of his childhood, and he's bewildered by the strife, of this new Karachi. Yeah. So I was seeing it in connection.
In the 90s. Yeah.
Right.
That was a shock. It was not the city, but the kind of
the conditions,
the deep tension that was felt by people. Yeah. In particular, who is my dear friend, and she had interjected a lot of this.
I wanted to ask you, Amar, because you and I are almost the same age. How when we were growing up, there were a lot of Goan people in Karachi. There was a huge Goan community, right? There was an Anglo-Indian community. Even in school, in our classrooms, there were, we had students of from different communities, religions, studying together. How much do you feel that is lost today in this Karachi?
I suppose it is. The literary milieu is very limited anyway. And if you come there for a short time and most of your friends are either bright with literature, then you by default are in an enclosed milieu, in a bubble. But yes, I mean, the school I went to, one desk mate was Parsi, one desk mate was Norwegian, one was Canadian, one was Japanese. My best friend for a while was Anglo-Indian, then the one after that was Goan, in fact.
Yeah.
I never thought much about it.
Being a
something
foodie,
that I was used to, and
being a foodie, I really miss the Goan restaurants. There was a lovely restaurant called Pereira with a bakery.
Oh,
my childhood.
Pereira.
Yeah.
Pereira.
Yes.
Yeah, Pereira.
Pereira.
It was always that. Yeah, those brown breads and black breads and things. Yes.
Yeah. So
there's nothing like that anymore.
Yeah. So that's
they've taught bakers and hotels how to do the stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember that very well. And then the bookshop had a Goan name, Anthony Coutinho.
Yes. Well, talking about bookshops, that's another very sad change in Karachi, that a lot of bookshops have disappeared. We have now very, very few bookshops, and they're mostly smaller shops in different localities. But the big bookshops have all disappeared, like Park American or Sasi or, all
Yeah,
these.
that's where I went. I mean, that was my
Thomas
go-to
and
place.
Thomas,
Yeah,
yeah,
Park
yeah.
American and Greenwich, which were just almost, they
Yes,
were walking distance from each other.
exactly,
Yeah, there
exactly.
were other places,
So
but I mean, there was Thomas and Thomas and Anthony
Thomas and
Coutinho as
Thomas,
well.
yes. Thomas and
But
Thomas still exists, but
yeah,
it's very small, and it's sort of
yeah.
trudging along, not really, doing very
My
well.
sisters went more to Greenwich because they liked Agatha Christie and
Uh-huh.
Georgia Thayer. I went more to Park American or Park Commercial because they had things like, the English classic retellings of Greek mythology. And,
Right.
it was better equipped for adolescent boys, in a sense. Whereas they were
What
reading English teen fare.
what I also miss about Karachi is the open spaces. It's really crowded now, and they're really ugly buildings up. And the tram, we used to have a tram, Amir. Do you remember that?
Oh, I remember that very vaguely, but I do remember. The fact is, I grew up mostly at PCHS, and we could play on the streets all day right into the evening. And then, to
Yeah.
spook ourselves out at 8 o'clock, which was to go back indoors, we would imagine that somebody had come to chase us or, run down the street with us. My closest friend in Karachi I've known all my life, and we often talk about this. I mean, she's lived there most of her life, and she's in defense now. But
Yeah.
purely by chance, she grew up in the house where my publisher and editor today lives. So, and constantly in a house that I played in. But we
Oh,
remember how we
wonderful.
ran to each other's places, telling our parents. And then in the evening, sometimes we just spook each other out by saying, somebody chased me and chased me. And we had figures called the kidnappers because we were reading all this Enid Blyton rubbish and so on, and being influenced by that.
Yeah. So I was recently
I could run
rereading.
down the hill from my place to the nursery.
Wow. Well, yeah, those
Alone.
hills have disappeared. We used to live in Bahadrabad, and
Yeah.
there was a hill over there also. No more hills in Karachi
Mm.
because of all the construction. Amir, I was recently rereading a column of yours in Dawn called Places of the Mind, which is sort of so relevant to what we are talking about today. It starts with, you talk about Muniza Shamsi's hybrid tapestries that you're talking about that book, and
Yeah.
you're talking about all the people and how rich the arts were in Karachi, and how many writers and artists lived here.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
wondering if you say that memories, books come out of places. At one place you say that, and at another place you talk about. You say it's not always a city that brings a story to life. More often, it's the story in its intimacy of detail that brings us the living people of the city's inhabitants, past and present.
Where did I write that? That's
You
true.
wrote that in that column. It's really lovely. I was rereading
It's the
it.
same one. Yeah.
It's in the same column. It's really interesting. Yes. So
Yeah,
I
that's
don't know how, when talking about how connected these writers who, like, Manto, as you say, moved to Lahore, or you are talking about Ismat Chughtai in the same column, and all these other people. Ismat, of course, didn't, but so many of the writers chose to live in Karachi.
Well,
How
Fazal Haidar was in Karachi for 7
yes,
years.
for a while, yes. How connected they were. And then you go on to say that the new breed of writers perhaps is more connected, like Kamila Shamsi and H.M. Naqvi or Veena Shah, because they write about the city by the sea, So it's really interesting. But I want you now to talk about a little about your latest book, Restless, because that is, of course, your partly your memoirs, and so
Yeah.
it is
In major
memory.
parts. Yeah.
Major part, yes. So, you sort of, you said in your interview also that that you're always restless for a place that is always far away. So tell us more about the book and your memoirs and how Karachi comes across in that.
Yeah, I think most of the book is really about experiences of the pandemic, isn't it? Or much of it is. And much is also about my experiences. So when I revisit the past, it's from the vantage point of the present, you know. Deaths remind me of friendships, like in the case of the writer Han Suyin, who was a dear friend. I mean, hearing about her death made me write about her as a person, as a loved person, or, you know, one that triggered off memories of another one. So when I go back into the past, it's very much as I'm living it today, rather than trying to reconstruct it, except for that piece, Restless, which I think I've said elsewhere, the title piece, which I was commissioned to write by Granta for a good sum of money, goodly sum of money. Not that I
Right.
didn't want to write memoirs at all. Not that I'm greedy, but that particular sum just said, oh, well, you know, 3 holidays this year or something like that. But the rest of it, much of the book is about the present. I think you particularly responded to one piece I wrote about the pandemic in London.
Yes. Yes.
When I first leave the house to go for a walk, yeah, and I think you wrote, Huri, somewhere that, you know, this is very telling for us in Karachi to read about this. I was speaking to all of you from here, you know, writing to the city of my birth, from the city of my adoption. A lot of the book is that way. That's why I call it instead of an autobiography.
Right.
Of course, there's one section in which I just transform myself into other people or some kind of twin of myself, so that I can do away with dates and chronologies. And that's, you know, a shortish section of the book.
I seem to remember another column of yours in which you wrote that you don't usually, when writing about memories, you do not fictionalize. Some people do tend to do that, but you don't. You try to be as close as possible, or if you
Yeah,
don't remember, you say,
no, I
you know,
think
you
what I'm
don't
trying to
remember.
say is that, yeah, yeah. What I'm trying to say is that, of course, everybody uses memory fiction. You know, a few of my stories here and there over the years have been semi-autobiographical or semi-autobiographical. But when I'm actually commissioned to write something like a piece about Horatullah Haider or a piece about my teens or something, I try to rebuild it as close as possible to real chronologies. I don't have a diary of my teenage years, but, you know, I have a diary which tells me about almost every time I met Annie, as we call her, and what she said, where, and so on and so forth. I assiduously honed her memoirs to be sure that what I said about her life elsewhere was, you know, true. And when I didn't remember specific dates, I would say it was either December or January, you know. But Annie herself taught me about eidetic memory. She said, look back and see what you can see, what you visualize, and you'll remember a lot of things. I mean, I find things by seeing them without knowing I'm seeing them. And I also realize that a lot of my oral memory is that way, and I can hear things. And I do remember word for word many things she said to me. I can quote her, you know, easily to you just now, something that she said at one point. And lots of her
Wonderful.
phrases like ghair zehni and zom and so on and so forth. You know, so it was all that memory, that part of my memory was in a way untapped because I had more or less tried to stay away from writing pure autobiography, if there is any such thing, or hard autobiography. I know there are lots of arguments about it, but that's the way I just finished
Right.
about my time in Karachi. And
Mm.
yeah, and again, I wanted to shift it into fiction. And I said, I'm not doing this. I just left out chunks of it because they, you know, they really can't be reported in nonfiction.
Yeah, that's a
Your
dilemma
thoughts,
that,
Arsalan?
yeah, and so that's a dilemma that I'm sort of facing because I'm trying to write my memoirs, not very successfully, and I don't know where. There's so many places where I would like to, you know, where I can't write without fictionalizing some parts of my life, but
Mm. You were also asking me about how I've used Karachi in my fiction. Well, there is a
Yes.
story in Turquoise and Cactus, which is called Electric Shadows. That's really my first attempt at pure, at just trying to remember things the way they were. And much of it is in the present tense. So I'm just repeating it. I haven't changed any of anything there. I only cut out little bits that my family was not happy for me to include. But that's my Karachi childhood, which is why there's none of that in the new book. There are just little bit of my Karachi childhood. And when you see Karachi, it's mostly the Karachi of today, or just day before yesterday, meaning the last 10 years that you see in that book. Because I didn't want to
Lovely.
do a childhood.
Fatma, you have written a review of Amir's book, and you know that book really well. Anything you want to add?
Well, I was going to talk about certain things that you guys mentioned, but school memories and just connecting it to my own things. But of Amir's book, I would like to, since we're talking about memories, and he mentions, and it's the first thing that he said to me in the conversation, the first conversation I ever had with him, and he mentioned that, oh, that is Zamane Batin, and I was so fascinated by that. And it's this, and it's there's a chapter in Rest about it, is translated to the interior moment. And I was thinking that when we access memories, it's not I mean, we're physically here, so it's the past and present at the same time happening simultaneously, and it's in the realm of imagination, and it's in that Zamane Batin, perhaps. So I love that aspect. Zamane Batin, yes, it is the interior moment, as Amir translated it.
But of course, it's not mutually exclusive because the interior moment can also be chronologically sound.
Yes, I mean, the way I feel it, it's the realm of imagination. Struck me as that, but you're right, it be chronological.
So, coming to your own, to you, Fatma, about your own work and about your memories and how you grew up in Pakistan, in Karachi specifically.
Yes.
You are from a different generation. Umi, Amir, and I are sort of from the same decade. But you are from a different generation, much younger than us. I want to know how you see Karachi, how, your poems reflect the disappearance of a certain memory, the disappearance of a place, or as you say, connected to the disappearance of a friendship or a friend of a memory. How do you perceive it? What are your memories of growing up in Karachi?
Well, you both were discussing school memories and people from different backgrounds. I went to a Christian school, went to Joseph's Convent, and so the atmosphere over there was always, a parallel universe to two religions which were close. That was just the background. But there were certain friendships that I made over there. I was 11 years studying in this school, my growing up years, and there are certain, and then there were fallouts of those friendships, those childhood friendships, and that created, and Amir mentioned the death of a friend. For me, death is kind of metaphoric, because those friends are still alive today, but I am no longer in contact with them, so they have become memories of a very strange kind for me. And when I think of place, so that school, that place is, I think it's all connected to time and place and relationships. It's not just an isolation, it all becomes a cluster. I think Sigmund Freud, in a paper of his, discusses mourning and melancholia. And mourning is natural grieving, and melancholia is this unnatural grieving, where you don't exactly know what you have lost, and you're not, is it a part of yourself? Is it who you were at that time? Is it a place? Is it all of it together? So and then Orhan Pamuk mentions that melancholia is in Turkish, it's called huzn, which has an element of beauty in it as well. So it's not just sorrow. There is an element of beauty of having lived those years with these friends, and then there is a loss as well. So in my book, one of the first lines of the poems is, "Will the lost can the lost return to me?" And the lost represents places and people and relationships and time, and I navigate in the entire canvas of my book. Can I make a reconnection in this artificial time, which the place of memories, which I can't touch, which I can't see, like Umi was mentioning sensory details, but for me it's like I cannot touch it, I cannot smell it, I cannot see it anymore except in my mind's eye. So for me it is like that, and it's like to be in this moment, in the present, and to be thinking about the past is almost like a double consciousness, because and a friend of mine once said that 2 drinks mixed is a very intense experience. So it's like the me of now and the me of then intermixed together at the site of a place, of a particular school, of those particular alleys, of those hallways. It's a very heightened experience. So yeah, it's I live here, I live in Karachi, but sometimes places of the same city are almost foreign, are almost memories, are almost of a different time.
Yeah, a lot of your poems have this sense of deja vu, and standing in an old place. Recently, I read this lovely poem written by you, called "Bookshelf of My Old Room," and the last few lines are so lovely. I would love to read them. There's so many books on this old bookshelf, in a room I no longer use, in a city no longer mine. I just find this line so telling. And Fatma, of course, at some point, I would like you to read out one of your poems. You talk about lost places due to losing friendships. And as you said, they're not friends who've died, but friends whom you've lost. There's this poem of yours, City of Karachi. How is that connected to a lost friendship or a lost memory?
It's one of my. I don't usually write political with a political mindset, but this particular poem that you mentioned is talking about that 90s Karachi that we lived, when there was a lot of terrorism on the streets and there were lots of disturbing news that we heard every day. And there's a line in this poem in which I say, "I gave up reading newspapers. I grew irises in my garden." Strange choice. But I mean, this idea that we created an alternate universe, these past friends, when we were friends, and we existed in a time where we said we will not let our spirit die of fear of those very terrifying times in the city endured. And it was like we experienced it all together, the intensity, which has become a strange, again, a double kind of a memory now, because we no longer talk. I cannot talk about it like you and Amir discussing over a cup of tea. These French, they're just my memories, and I wonder if they think about it, if they don't. But I don't know. They're just my memories of that time that we experienced together.
When I was talking with Amir about food places that are gone, I recalled your poem, "An Old Cafe."
Forgotten Cafe, yes.
Forgotten Cafe, yes. Is that about a particular cafe that you used to go to a lot?
Yes. Yes. There was this, it was a restaurant. I turned it into a cafe in the poem, called Copper Kettle in Karachi. And we used to visit it a lot. And a few years ago, I decided to go looking for it just to experience it. And I couldn't find it anywhere. I asked people, is Copper Kettle still
In
there? And they
Zamzama.
said, yes, in Zamzama. It no longer exists. So that poem was about that. And I have it here. If you want, I can read it out.
Yes, please do.
Yes, just a second. Yeah. Forgotten Cafe. The blue venom of a summer evening enters a glass of water ordered at a forgotten cafe, stings the lips that leave a trace kiss on the rim. I am unaware and muse over your last words, held like a delicacy in my mind. Who would say it's been so long? Suddenly, the liquid reaches the tongue. It's poisonous from here on. Words don't form in the mouth. Did you ever solve the riddle between us? In an instant age, you have severed impulse. Remember when we learned of irony? It was together.
Lovely, lovely.
Thank you.
So, Umi, what for you, having lived in England so long, are there places that you've lost memory of, places that you used to see a lot, or as Amir and I were talking, bookshops that have closed down?
Well, I actually grew up on an inland naval base in Lonavala, which is in the Western Ghats. And it's a really stunning place. I mean, when we lived there, it was completely wild. You know, in the monsoon, you'd get these incredible waterfalls, which obviously are still there. And it was like overnight, the clouds came very, very low. So everything was really damp. So, you know, your handbags, your shoes, your belts would all turn green overnight and everything sort of smelt of mildew. But it was stunningly beautiful there. And at that time, Lonavala was just like, from what my recollection of it, there was just one kind of square in the village center that had sort of wooden stalls in a kind of square, and they sold saris and chicky, which of course is a big product of Lonavala. And Kandala, where Mulk Rajanan, the writer, lived, who was a friend of my mother's, he lived on this kind of wild estate, and there were leopards prowling around. One of his dogs was actually eaten by a leopard that swallowed it whole while it was on a chain. So it got the python got chained to the pillar of his house. Well, I went back to Lonavala a few years ago, and now it's quite a big town. The naval base is still there and hasn't changed all that much. I did go in and meet the Commodore now, who is my father was the captain there. So he was in the same house I grew up in, the captain's house. But it's strange going back to places you've been before when they've changed so much. It's very much a tourist place now, Lonavala. And it's lost a lot of the natural, I think the wildness, because of the landscape being so incredibly rugged and mountainous. That is still there, but all the wildlife has pretty much gone. I mean, I can remember as a child just lying in bed and hearing jackals and hyenas, you know. The other place that, my home city, basically, because I was born in Ashwini Hospital in what was Bombay then, Mumbai. I go back now, and Bombay actually hasn't changed that much. At least the part that I go to, Colaba and Fort area, which was the old kind of British-built area. There are a lot of trees there, very big old trees, and the streets are quite wide, and you've got these big stone buildings. That hasn't changed a huge amount. But the rest of Mumbai now, it just goes right up to the mainland, and it's so crowded and concrete now. When the rains come, everything floods because there's no earth for anything to sink into. So it's kind of like parts of the city I feel very much as have changed. This block of flats we lived in 1962, that block of flats is still there, and where my father lived was just opposite.
Can I ask you what it's called?
But a lot of things have changed.
I think,
so
Amir, can you speak a little louder? I think Umi didn't hear you.
Sorry.
I said, can I ask you what the block of flats is called?
It's called Dawlat.
The name of the block?
Dawlat.
Dawlat.
It was. It's just outside Navy Nagar Gate in Colaba.
Yeah. I'll tell you something later. Okay.
Go ahead and if you want to.
My family was in Windmere, just outside Navy Nagar Gate.
Oh.
You know Windmere?
All right.
So
I
know
don't
this
actually.
very well. Yeah, I spent holidays in Bombay till I was 39 years old.
All right.
So,
yeah.
Sometimes places change because history changes. I don't know if any of you, of course, Fatma is much younger, but have any of you ever suffered trauma because of a change? Because I did. I studied in Moscow in the late 70s and early 80s, and I was there till 1983. And a few years after that, everything changed. It was no longer the Soviet Union. And when I went back in 1993, which was the early years of the perestroika, I was there for a week or maybe 10 days, and it was a traumatizing experience for me because the change was so, it was such a huge change. It was a country no longer existed. It was also because it was the early years of the perestroika, and the new country was, and the people were still finding their way about in those years. So economically, it was a very hard time for them also, and culturally, I mean, a country that was so rich in culture, suddenly, all the theaters and cinema and everything, because there was not enough money for these things to survive, which had always been state sponsored. Books, I mean, I was traumatized to see people selling their libraries on the road. This for a nation that prided itself on reading, So yeah, those early years. Now I go back, it's not like that, but that first visit was, I don't know if any of you has an experience like that to talk about.
On a very mild level, I mean, places from London are vanishing that I was used to. My topography of London is changing. Like a few bookshops just went, branches of Waterstones where, I acquired much of the library I now have. The French bookshop shut down, the Italian bookshop shut down, or they reopened in smaller places. So my trajectories of travel have changed. The cafe very near me, where I've often met Pakistani friends who are visiting, and of course local friends, including Kamala Shamsi, who's about 10 minutes away from me, and we'd often have coffee here. It's gone. It's become a pret-a-manger as of yesterday. And a bus, I mean, this is very strange. We also need to talk about modes of transportation that take us from one place to another. Until last week, I've been able to travel from where I live in Little Venice to Chelsea or South Kensington directly bus. The 414, and that's now been cancelled. So, my route is now closed. That's that kind of thing. It's not devastating, but it's sad, You kind of atavistically sometimes, when you're on a bus or walking down a road, look for a particular place and remember it's gone. It's no longer there. And
Right.
The amount that the street near where I live, the high street, Clifton Road has changed, is quite astonishing. The number of chain shops that have, chain stores, or what you call them, restaurant chains that have opened here, including the aforementioned pret-a-manger. Yeah, so London is changing day by day. Literally day by day. And of course the pandemic hasn't helped very much.
And I think even what Umi talks about, the wildlife disappearing, that's such a sad thing, when you think of it in the whole prospect of global warming and what is happening in the pandemic and all that. So before we sort of conclude, anything else any of you want to add to this or ask each other? And then perhaps, Fatma, you can read out another poem of yours before we, say goodbye.
Yeah, just only talking about Bombay and realizing that we are born in the same decade, that we've seen the same Kalaba. My cousin still lives in Navy Nagar, so it's quite interesting. Those buildings that
really?
haven't changed, even though I haven't been back for many years. Yeah, it's
I stay with a friend very close to the Taj in Calabar, so it's still very much my stamping ground.
Wonderful. Fatma,
it will
over
be
to
mine
you,
too when I
Fatma.
come back. I have other relatives around Naples Sea Road, but okay, over to poetry now. But it's nice to have shared nostalgia about something, or places we both can go back to in our minds.
This one is called Losing Karachi. A strange sun setting upon the ocean, blue, silver, green. Of all the things I lost, I miss it the most. And I miss the entirety of relationships. It's noon and it's nighttime, the functioning of a clock and the passing of an hysteric. I miss the boom of the city as it travels upon eggshells, seashores. The intricate seashell design of home and its marvels, the coming and goings of friends and whispers, the fall of dusk and the shape upon the trees of familiar shadows, what is preserved in memory as artifacts of a tomb, the silhouette of love and its first fashioning, its drop to sheer gravity of sleep that was lost in wakeful hours. The slapstick humor of growing up, the bungalow at the eastern end of town and the cargo train whizzing by. The first pet, arriving like a newborn, his nose all sniffling black, his ears upturned like a bookmark. The space of becoming older, dolls losing shape to watches. Signboards stretching to lampposts, reminding one of the map of the city, oblong, silver, turquoise, the frame of the sky, and the picturesque sudden star, the only one visible. What does it feel like to be lost on your streets? The star is indivisible tonight, and there are no answers.
Thank you. Thank you. That was lovely, Fatma. Thank you so much, Ummi. Thank you, Amir. Thank you, Fatma. This was a wonderful session. And I hope our listeners and our audience enjoy it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I love that poem, Fatma, and the other one.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.